Welcome to the Influence Industry interview series brought to you by Tactical Tech. We interview experts to understand the technologies, the companies, and the personalities behind political campaigns across the world. If you want to find out more, check out influenceindustry.org.
I've been doing this kind of research for more than 3 years now. And the way I search for data and identify those data sets is pretty much straightforward, and there is no rocket science behind that. So that's the core thing behind my work. I don't utilize any penetration techniques or sophisticated things to find the data to see what's already exposed in public domain. I highlight this in order to show how easy it is to particularly anyone with internet connection to search for data, find it online, and I hope responsibly disclose it to the owners. But at the same time, to show how dangerous it is for any organization or business to have their assets inadvertently or any other way exposed to public internet, and how easy it is to find and perhaps accidentally see this stuff. So I don't use any, like I said, any active scanning, anything too much automative. I utilize data stream that comes from public search engines such as Shodan, Binary Age, Tensor, Zoomeye. So those are IoT, Internet of Things search engines that technically work pretty much like Google, but only for devices connected to the internet. Any sorts of databases, webcams, routers, technically everything that you connect to the internet might be, or I would say will be, scanned, crawled by those engines and presented in a very user-friendly way to anyone who would use that engines.
I read somewhere, or I saw somewhere, that you started down the path of doing this work kind of unexpectedly, starting out working at a large company that suffered a large data breach.
Yeah.
Tell us what happened and how that shaped your journey into doing the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, that was a pretty painful experience, but at the same time, it immediately grabbed me into the world of security, cybersecurity, and the related stuff. So at that time, I was working in a PR and communications department, and so with that in mind, I was completely unaware about any sorts of search engines that would index your exposed stuff. I was pretty much distanced from any exposures, data breaches, etc. So I didn't know how it works. But the exposure, the data breach that our company experienced was really surprising. And since myself and my colleagues were pretty much sure that the data could not end up like this in public domain. So we started to understand the reasons behind the exposure, and myself, I also got really curious about what happened. But the only answer that I heard at that time was that it was a mistake, a human mistake that brought into the light. So I started to, learn more by myself, and also with the help of other security researchers who were doing similar kind of stuff. I started to play around with those engines, started to elaborate my own approach to finding the data. And since then I decided to continue this as an independent journey outside the company and do that, for alerting the companies and businesses so they can prevent similar things that happens to us. And then I started consult other companies, share my knowledge and experience that I gathered throughout this. That was my kind of professional growth as a expert security consultant. And I originally thought it wouldn't take much time. So I thought that just bad timing or some sort of coincidence that data breaches or exposures happen. So then companies soon realized that it's so easy to fix that at the very beginning or do some sort of internal analysis before the piece with the data sets are indexed by search engines. But no, that didn't happen, and pretty much otherwise the whole, I would say, tsunami started to grow up with all those exposures, data breaches, then ransomware attacks came in, and I found myself in pretty challenging and exciting times when companies really needs to be educated about the pitfalls and dangers of simple human mistakes, and the cost of that mistake might be too high. When I read about all those ransomware cases or hackers attacks, I understand that at the very bottom of this is not a sophisticated attack in most of the cases. It's just a human mistake or some piece of information that was left publicly exposed, and then it grew up like a snowball and end up in compromisation of data or stealing the data. Pretty much every case that I read about recently, it all started with something really small, a token or a secret key or password found somewhere on GitHub or Google, Slack channel, you name it. So it all takes just one piece of information that then would fill into the complete profile of an organization or a person that is a target.
One of the questions I'd say as an organization, we try to sort of preempt, we try to answer before it really even comes up, is why this work matters. Obviously, I think that's a very easy thing to convince a company that has just been exposed in some way or someone whose identity has been stolen. I think it's very easy to talk to such people or organizations about the value of their online privacy and security, but perhaps a different kind of conversation with people who haven't, or organizations that haven't felt the sting so personally. Have you noticed any kind of change in the course of 3 years you've been doing this work in the way these issues are being talked about?
The amount of cases that I report is not changing. I would say even despite the fact that anyone now knows about all those default configuration that needs to be properly secured. Even vendors, software, hardware vendors are now doing all those precautions measures at the very beginning, so they don't set up their devices to be passwordless by default. They really insist and alert user who set up their system that you need to be careful about the next step of setting up a password. Make sure that your password policy is configured properly. So a lot of those steps are introduced by many vendors. I would say all of them. Despite all those measures, it's historically that humans are stupid. That they always do mistakes, and they only learn from their own mistake when they happen. They don't learn from other mistakes. If that would happen, then we wouldn't see any wars or crisis or anything like that. So when a big company has a data breach, it only learns from that experience. It doesn't learn from, for example, from other companies' experience having data breach, even a large one exposing sensitive information of their users. So answering your question, there is no decline in amount of cases that we report. There is a steady flow of those cases, and I assume that this won't change. Still, I don't feel myself fighting windmills like some sort of anime hero or just a Superman doing his job. I really believe that with every case that I report, I prevent some bigger exposures, and companies can learn from those small cases, minor incidents, and prevent big things from happening. There are a lot of companies, Fortune 100 companies, that I managed to alert when they had their secrets or configurations exposed in plain text, and you didn't hear that in the news or somewhere else, because it was patched in a really responsive and prompt way. And there was no way that anyone else could have seen that. At least I hope so. So those are those cases that inspire and makes me believe that we do something significant for the community, and at least educational wise.
You mentioned a second ago about humans all learning from their mistakes and wars and crises. So I think it's a good transition into your own work around discoveries or exposures that have been related to political data or data that could have been used to advance political goals. Perhaps you could talk to us about a sum of those that might come to mind, or perhaps you feel that virtually every exposure you identify can be used to advance political aims, depending on who accesses it.
Yeah, indeed. I used to discover a lot of at least U.S. voters information a year or 2 years ago. Now I don't see that much. I don't know the reason. Maybe those companies responsible for that, they really took that seriously and somehow restricted the access to the data. But at the same time, there is a alarming trend of so-called marketing data or socio data, sociographics data, data collected from social media platforms in a way that is called scraping. So all this information combined and properly structured might complete a pretty full picture of a user. And if cross-checked with other databases, voters databases, or any other marketing data sets, that would create a pretty complete profile on anyone on the web. So nowadays, I assume everything is recorded when you're online. It's recorded for good reasons, at least to ease your life. For example, to collect caches when you browse, to make your work easier. But at the same time, those pieces of information are locked, stored somewhere, And every day of our existence on this planet, on a digital existence, creates petabytes and petabytes of logs, any sorts of data collections that needs to be stored somewhere. And cloud storage is, as we know it, is not something in the sky. These are physical computers connected to each other, and they also are potentially explosive to any sort of misconfigurations or human mistakes, as we all seen. But the situation changes every day in terms of the amount of data that's being collected and its storage size. So the scale and the probability of those data to be exposed is also grows exponentially. That's perhaps the reason why I don't see any decrease in the number of cases. If you imagine that the amount of data remains the same, then of course we would see the decrease of such cases. But every hour, every second, there is a new universe of data is born. That's terrifying at the same time, but we also need to understand that that's the reality we need to face because we entered that era when we discovered the internet and the way that we communicate. So we need to cope with that. I don't share the vision that you have to totally isolate yourself from digital world and don't leave any digital trace behind, because that would be impossible, and that would only make yourself a paranoid. There is no way you would avoid your digital footprint to be recorded, even if you distance yourself from social media. There are other ways when you will be caught up and locked somewhere. If you start thinking about it, it's crazy. So you have to be rational about the data, of course, and your digital bits and pieces that you live in this world, but don't be paranoid about it. If your email or phone number is somewhere else, just cope with it and make sure you have several addresses used in different cases. Don't be so crazy about any information that you might leave behind. But at the same time, you have to be aware of the dangers that it might create, and be rational and reasonable about potential inquiries and incoming messages about your social profile or phishing email. So these are all chains of one line. It's all about common sense and understanding of how this world of data is structured. So I would imagine that all those incidents involving voting information, your social media profiles information, combined and collected in a variety of ways, there will be more of that in the coming years, months, but they won't be such newsbreakers.
Yes.
Because it's pretty much out there already. It's only matter of time when it will reappear again in one way or another.
I'm curious, more with an eye towards the security considerations that such political candidates should be thinking about. What would you tell them, given that many of them, it seems, at least based on some of the work that we have done, are very quick to embrace the idea of running a big data-driven campaign, but are not as quick to think about the risks involved in doing so. If you were to give a candidate like that advice, more towards things that should be on their mind in a more digital security oriented way, what is it that you would tell them?
You need to educate yourself on cyber hygiene, at least the very basic principles of how cyber hygiene works. I barely can think about anyone in our political environment who really thinks about that, and I would suggest that that will be a must for anyone doing digital campaigns or stepping up this path in the future, because there are a lot of exclamations about how they care about data security, about privacy of their users' data, but and the reality is that's only proclamations. They really don't consider that as an important part of their program, or that's really needs to become a part of their promise, political promise, that the data that they collect from the very beginning when they are in place, they would protect it as it was their information about their personal information. And prove that with educational activities or some sort of preventional measures, active preventional measures, to show real actions on how they protect their users' privacy and personal information they definitely collect throughout the campaign. That would be really important. Of course, if you are target for a sophisticated hacking attack, there is barely a way to avoid your data from being compromised. But the more aware you are of the potential tactic, strategy of those who would target your data, the more protected you are. So the less likely there is a chance that the data of your users will be stolen. I'm talking not about misconfiguration event. I'm talking about a really sophisticated attack by APTs or hacking groups that might employ some sort of technical intrusions onto your computer's hard drives. So any politicians need to be aware of both passive and active defense line when it comes to cyber security and cyber hygiene. Yeah, that would be really important.
Totally. I think that's very similar to part of the stance we have taken on the same matter, that if we're talking to a political candidate somewhere in the world that's very intent and keen on running a data-intensive campaign, I think they need to live their values. They can't claim to care about digital security and yet put out digital products that claim to protect people's security in the process. That's an absolute contradiction. I think that's absolutely part of it for sure.
And just to add to that, most, if not all, entities related to political environment, some sort of agencies or political candidates. We even discovered Donald Trump's campaign emails, credentials left online. It was almost impossible to get in touch with the people who were responsible for keeping that data secured. There were no dedicated emails for responsible disclosure, for security or privacy alerts, and obviously there were no proper response to any of our emails when it came to alerting a politician or politically related organization about an exposure. They are the most slowest and non-responsive organizations when it comes to incident response. So that's that's really a shame, and I wish the situation change in the future with that piece of advice that I just given. So just create a dedicated contact for your campaign when it comes to reporting an issue from white hat security researcher. Perhaps that would solve a lot of issues with your users' data. And with a few of those who responded to our alerts, to my alerts, most of those were really aggressive about the same finding the same fact of this data being found somewhere. So
yes,
that's another side of the story.
I understood that there was a case recently in which you tried informing the Calgary Parking Authority of a security lapse on their part, but they never actually even responded to you. So it sounds like the owner isn't even known of this Elasticsearch database. How do you adhere to the principles of responsible disclosure when the parent organizations are unreceptive or unknown in the first place?
So we really don't publicize things before they are secured. So in order not to create any hints to someone with malicious intent trying to find this piece of information and grab it, sell it, compromise it. But there are cases and a few cases when data remained online for years, and the party, the responsible party was completely non-responsive, and in that case we usually contact hosting providers to force them to take down those IPs, or at least contact the owners of data. So we send abuse reports to them. But in some cases, when hosting providers aren't Amazon, Microsoft, or Google, or other big players who obviously take these things seriously, there are a lot of small providers that, if located outside of Europe or US, they are completely non-responsive, similarly to the owner's data. So the process might take months to get this data down. And when it is secured one way or another, then we usually publish this in order to raise awareness that this data probably was seen by anyone at that time, given the amount of time that it was online. So that creates additional risks for those whose information was exposed. Yeah, that's rarely the case these days, but still there are a lot, not a lot, but some cases when, for example, with this 35 million database, it was taken down by Amazon at the end of the day when we were unable to identify the owner, and Amazon informed the customer, and they took down it. But originally they completely ignored the owners. The alleged owners ignored our alerts. So yeah, that happens a lot of time, and the main thing here that we don't publicize anything before it's secured.
As you were saying earlier, the tools that you employ are relatively unsophisticated. Not to disparage your own approach at all, but I think you yourself were saying that there's nothing exceptionally. No rocket science, I think, was the term you used earlier, and yet there seems to be, when some of these cases arise, a clear interest in the part of the parent organization to frame the methods that led to the exposure as ones that were exceptionally sophisticated. And so there is kind of this confusion, sometimes intentional, about sophistication and complexity made in security. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, and more importantly, what consequences you think that this confusion has in practice.
Well, for any company that would report a data breach, that event would be described as a sophisticated cyber attack. So that's a rule. You want to go and publicly admit that it was just a production database password left by developer.
Admin.
Yeah, that would still be a sophisticated cyber attack. And in 99% of cases, the audience, users, customers, they would feel that there is no enough transparency in this communication, because the company won't admit any sort of misconfiguration like that. So that's perhaps the best way to answer, or at least formulate my thoughts on that matter. There, in the public environment, there will be always a sophisticated attack rather than plain text password found somewhere on the web. So and you won't hear it on the conferences or somewhere else, only in informal communications. But like I mentioned, from my experience, 99% of cases reported by me or reported by someone else, or the information that was stolen, it was a result of a simple misconfiguration or some really unpredictable thing to happen.
Do you think that one of the reasons why seemingly simple exposures are framed as ones that are complex is related to a gap in journalistic understanding of the mechanics of identifying some of these? I realize this is a broad generalization. Why is it that you think the narrative tends to be so uniform in public discourse?
My assumption would be that this is done with the goal to avoid any public shame, and also fines and other things related to legislative measures. So if you exposed your data in public and it was your mistake, then you would probably be fined, and that amount would be surprising for any company. But if you would say that it was a result of an attack or hacking intrusion, then this is someone else's fault. This was behind our capabilities to prevent it. This was a numerous DDoS attack or insider threat that was beyond our control, and that's why we are not so responsible for that incident. So the only thing we can say is that we're sorry, and that won't ever happen again. At least we will strengthen our security perimeter. So that's that's perhaps the more viable excuse for officials, for agencies.
I've worked with some scholars who say that at the end of the day, GDPR and CCPA are not so much solving the problem as much as they are changing the way we talk about the problem. And maybe changing the way we talk about the problem is a form of progress, but that's still different from actually solving the underlying problem itself. obviously, as part of your work, you also inform law enforcement, I'm sure, from time to time of disclosures. I'm curious from your point of view, what your thoughts are on the law's effectiveness or lack of effectiveness in solving these problems are, or even not necessarily just effectiveness, but the law's potential to solve these problems, even if it's not solving those problems right now.
So I see at least one good outcome of all those legislative measures. They oblige the companies to create proper privacy policies on their pages, which in turn created at least one valid channel for security researchers like myself to report the problem directly to the company. So that's I would say that's the most feasible outcome of this. And in some cases, of course, those emails are bouncing and they don't reply. But at least there is this established or means to be established channel of communications, and that's encouraging, at least for the community. At the same time, those measures also created this level of fear or some sort of positive fear that the companies needs to feel about losing their data, their customers' data, and they also fear when they respond to our requests. They also fear on the possible consequences that the public disclosure might have. So they really want to comply with all those regulations and work proactively with security community to mitigate the risks connected with the consequences of the GDPR violation, for example. So they also create unnecessary positions inside the companies, as any sorts of compliance officers and additional people who would check up those emails. This creates this, at least, imitation of work that sometimes is helpful. So I really would, I only welcome that initiative, and I think that created many positive ways for the researchers and the companies to work together and to reply to all those potential threats to the data of their customers.
I'm curious to just zoom out a little bit and to hear your own speculations, if you feel comfortable sharing them, about how you envision these problems being solved or not solved down the road, and perhaps part of that might reflect to some extent what you feel the problem really is, why it is that security and privacy tends to be so undervalued on the market. You know, I've spoken to some people who say that we will enter a future in which privacy conscious tech products are going to be the sort of new organic food, where people will pay a premium for them for access to digital technologies that respect their security and privacy. And it will start as a kind of luxury good, but over time, it will come to be more and more accessible to more people. And only by understanding our digital security and privacy as a personal good or personal liability will we begin to actually seeing these problems solved. I just say solved because, of course, I think the possibility of a future in which only people with capital or money have access to online environments or experiences that protect their digital security is maybe not a solution at all. But this is one idea that I've heard about how some thinkers think this problem actually will unfold in the future. I'd love to, as someone who identifies so many lapses of digital security practices all over the internet, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the bigger picture of how you see these problems unfolding or being solved or not being solved in the future.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. That opinion that you just mentioned, and myself, I'm a believer that the whole situation would change only if everyone would be aware of the issue, not only on paper, but also with the mindset properly set up. And when cyber hygiene and educational wise side of things would be part of our culture, so that's something that needs to be raised from the early schools days, when kids needs to be taught about the cyber threats and the more importantly the ways they may want to do in order to prevent their personal data from being exposed. So I do have a lot of trainings and webinars with all those scenarios and takeaways when you can learn about the tools and methods which are not so complicated, that can be used on everyday basis, and literally they needs to be part of our everyday life. It's like brushing your teeth. It's not that simple. It's not that complex to check up your IPs or emails or password, whether they are compromised or not, on a regular basis. There are a lot of user-friendly services that helps you to do with that, and they are completely secured, so you don't need to feel scared about using them. So yeah, my take on this is that only when we are all educated, that situation would change. It pretty much resonates with the COVID situation, with the pandemic that we see right now. Only when you have this collective immunization, or when everyone is vaccinated with their dose of cyber hygiene immunity, then we might see the end. But the threats, the viruses, they are always changing. So at least the knowledge itself might be a good weapon against them. So that's how you avoid crowded places or do social distancing. So all this relates to cyber hygiene. So it works in the very similar way.
If you enjoyed today's interview and you want to find out more about the influence industry, data-driven political campaigns, and anything else about Tactical Tech's work, check out influenceindustry.org.